Sidekick here with the latest update on the little Cold War project we've been running on my Discord server called The Balloon Goes Up. If you haven't been following along, you may want to go back and check some of the earlier videos that I've done on the topic, because this started out to be a video, but it's become, well, a thing. The point of the original video was to ask the question, can we make a scenario, a mission in DCS that recreates what a Cold War gone hot confrontation between the Warsaw Pact and NATO in Northwest Europe would have looked like and felt like to the pilots that flew the planes, and specifically the pilots flying the United States Air Force A-10, the Hawg. See, the problem I've always had, or rather the thing that I've always wanted to get out of flying in DCS, that I've never really gotten, was to figure out what the A-10 was good for in its original design. The A-10A was the first paid module that I owned, and I've owned the C and the C2 as well. But, I mean, the Hawg is unique, but why? And there are a lot of opinions out there, but instead of arguing about it, I just wanted to try it in a realistic way. And so, The Balloon Goes Up was born. I asked myself some questions like, what would a Soviet invasion have looked like with the weapons and doctrines of the time, the early 1980s? I asked myself, what would NATO have done in response to the weapons and doctrine that they had at the time? And in particular, how would they have used that very unique weapon, the Hawg? Well, the answers kind of surprised me. First of all, I learned that one of the most important things that the A-10 pilots did was to learn their area of operations. I mean, not the air traffic rules and circuits and patterns, but I mean the actual ground in the area of operations itself. I mean, NATO was perfectly aware of where the Soviet or Warsaw Pact incursion was going to come from. This was not a surprise. So, pilots that were posted to Germany, often from A-10 squadrons in the United Kingdom, would be expected to basically memorize an area of operations that contained the ground over which the Soviet invasion was expected to occur. They were expected to fly close to the ground, and remember, the original A-10 didn't have a moving map or a GPS. I mean, the HUD could provide cues about where to go, but it couldn't tell you anything about where you were. And so, also, it couldn't tell you much about where the friendly and enemy forces were. These things you had to know by knowing the ground, not from 15,000 feet, but from 15 feet at 300 miles an hour. So a good Hawg driver was expected to know where they were in any weather at any time of the year without looking at a map. To be an A-10 pilot meant that your area of operations was your neighborhood. So when I started making the missions, the first thing I did was start christening the ground, which is what I was taught to call it when I was a forward observer in the artillery. Basically, it means you need to develop a shorthand for how to point things out on the ground that you and, all of your teammates understand so that you can talk people onto things on the ground. So, the first lesson in DCS terms was that if you want to fly like an A-10 pilot in the Cold War, you have to fly over the same piece of ground a lot. A lot. To the point where you have to know where you are even when you're at treetop level. Now, this means doing a lot of flying that doesn't necessarily involve shooting at things, which is not your typical DCS experience, let's face it. So anyways, we did that. And, I say we, because actually the first thing I realized in putting these missions together is that they really can't be flown in single player. I mean, no Hawg pilot ever expected to fly so. Everything, and I mean everything, they learned how to do, they learned to apply as a team. So while making a single player scenario might be useful for kind of demonstrating some principles, it could never teach anyone what it was actually like to fly a Hawg. So I recruited some other players who seemed to be as interested in the topic as I was, and we got to work trying it out, trying to become Hawg drivers. And that's what you see in the background. As I'm talking, you're looking at some of those guys actually at work in a recent mission that we flew. Having a pretty good mission, actually. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I'll just let you enjoy the show while I talk. Now, the first thing that we did when we started getting this together was we decided that all of our missions would be based on pretty much the same small area of the Caucasus map. And you probably know where that is. If you don't, you can check some of your earlier videos. And once we had decided where they were going to be set, we set out to get to know the area and to develop our own handles for various terrain features. Names like Snake River, Central Park, Sleepy Hollow, the Valley of Death, the town of Chiclets, all of which you've heard me refer to before in previous videos. So again, go check those out if you don't know what I'm talking about. Now, these have become so second nature to us, we don't even know we're doing it anymore, which I think is probably what would have happened to squadron pilots at the time. So, the next realization that I had was that the A-10 was not actually expected to fly mainly close air support missions, and that's actually because of the nature of the fight and the tactics that both the Warsaw Pact and NATO expected to use, but it was a bit of a surprise. You see, in a Warsaw Pact invasion, the Warsaw Pact would be expecting to use numbers and momentum to overcome an enemy that had only a limited ability to trade space for time. The West Germans were not keen on the idea that they would give up much territory in order to slow the Soviets down. So the key to the Warsaw Pact system was to develop straightforward tactics that emphasized constant forward pressure, backed up by massive amounts of firepower. It was a sledgehammer, it was not a rapier. The NATO response was to force delay by forcing each echelon to deploy, and by separating the forward echelon from its support, so that that echelon could be defeated piecemeal, or so that the NATO covering forces could withdraw in good order, set up again, and repeat the process. So what the ground forces on the NATO side really wanted then, the Air Force, was not help in protecting troops in contact, which is the close air support mission. The Army believed that it had more than enough organic and precise firepower to handle that job. What the Army wanted was for the Air Force to delay and degrade the follow-on echelons, to effectively isolate the assaulting elements from their reinforcement and from their fire support, thus making them more vulnerable. So the job of the A-10 was not close air support. It was actually battlefield interdiction, in a textbook definition, meaning that the job was to find and destroy and neutralize or delay the depth echelons of the attacking force, rather than to arrive over the battlefield and be talked onto targets by forward air controllers working with the ground force. Again, this put a premium on knowing where to look for the enemy. We were not expecting someone to point them out, we were expecting to have to go find them. But we also expected to know where to look. Within our area of operations, there just weren't that many places where the enemy could come from with that many vehicles. Again, this makes it pretty different than most of the missions you will have flown on any, certainly multiplayer server for DCS. And, it turns out, again, that the number of vehicles is a really specific part of this scenario, a really specific part of the problem. I mean, once we started putting real-sized Soviet units on the map with realistic separation at realistic speeds, the nature of the beast really started to become obvious. When you have a motor rifle regiment headquarters element with more than 50 vehicles in it, or a full motor rifle battalion with more than 60, you start to get a handle on the magnitude of the problem that NATO pilots and NATO ground forces faced. So in this scenario, in DCS terms, you can't just be proficient at using your weapons. You have to be efficient as well. When you are a 6-ship of A-10s up against more than 100 vehicles, and they are moving towards a small covering force that already has its hands full with a reinforced company attack, when they're moving even at 15 miles an hour, it really puts a premium on making every shot count. And this really puts a premium on survival as well. Every Hawg is a vital asset in this fight. Even if you live to tell the tale, if you lose your airplane, you have done some major damage to the chances of the Warsaw Pact being stopped. And again, this is a pretty different attitude than you go into a lot of DCS scenarios with. In fact, our motto became, kill ratio is king. I mean, you have to make every round count. You have to survive to use all of your weapons and head home to reload. And you have to make every one of those weapons count. The key to doing that is to use the Hawg's two great advantages, it turns out. And those advantages, whether or not you believe me, are that it flies slowly, and also that it flies for a long time. And finally, we realized why both of these things were true and why they were really advantages, and why the Hawg was built to fly this way. In the Hawg, when you're flying the Hawg, you have time and gas to fly all over the battlefield. You have the time and the attention span to watch for the enemy, but also to watch your flight mates as they stir up the hornet's nest. And then once you know where the enemy is, you can pull back, look at the ground and the enemy in your weapons panel, and pick the right tactics. Because the thing to realize is that you know an awful lot about the threat you're facing. You know what kinds of vehicles and how many, including the air defense assets. In a motor rifle regiment advancing to contact, there are precisely 4 SA-9 Strelas and 4 Shilkas. There are also up to 30 man-pads detachments grouped 3 to a vehicle, scattered throughout the regimental headquarters and the maneuver battalions. But those detachments, the man-pads detachments, need to stop and deploy in order to fire, which they are not supposed to do until they are forced by the enemy. So in fact, if you force the man-pads dets to deploy, you've already accomplished something. So the sensible strategy, though, if you're flying a Hawg in this situation, is to take out those big air defense units first, particularly the Shilkas, because, I mean, the A-10 is actually a pretty tough target for IR SAMs, especially head-on, and especially if flown well and using countermeasures properly. But the A-10 is easy meat for a Shilka. So stalk the Shilkas carefully, ideally find them and fix them, and then take them out at standoff distances, particularly with Mavericks if you've got them. If you can't do that, stalk them carefully until they're close enough to cover that you can use, and then pop up and get them with the gun. But don't miss. Seriously though, one major skill you need to have as a Hawg pilot in this situation is the ability to read the ground. The only sure way to be safe from a threat is to put a hill or a ridge, or even trees, between you and it. If you want to survive in the Hawg trough, you need to be able to look at the enemy, look at the ground, do the math in your head, and figure out how to make a covered approach, pop up, launch your attack, and get back behind cover before the enemy can do anything about it. You have to nibble around the edges of their weapon effect zone. It's a tight squeeze, but you can hit them with rockets and the gun at ranges that are tough for them to get at you, but barely. And of course, while you're doing that, you need someone watching your back and telling you, when you're padlocked, that you're getting too close and to knock it off. I mean, friends don't let friends fly into the Shilka-Wez. But once you get the air defense units located and whittled down, there isn't anything on the battlefield that can stand up to a Hawg for very long. I have seen a single 4-ship of Hawgs, like the one you're watching, kill as many as 40 vehicles in 40 minutes. And they could have gone on longer if basically my butt hadn't gotten tired watching them, and we had to end the session. In other words, if you want to survive in this world, you have to be a good Hawg driver, and that means learning to fly the aircraft in its comfort zone. Low, slow, persistent, and deadly. So don't listen to the fast jet boys. While they're doing their hot dogging and their one-and-done runs, you're out there defeating the enemy one vehicle at a time for hours at a time. There's no question in my mind who in this scenario would be the kill ratio king. So, soo-wee, it is Hawg feeding time. If you want to take part in any of these missions, please, please, please drop by my Discord channel. We're just trying to build a group of people, a big enough group of people that are interested in this that it'll justify putting in the effort to make even more of these missions. And so far, we're getting there. We've got quite a group of people that's interested, and pretty much everybody who's tried it has really found it interesting. And you can certainly see that the guys in the background here are having a good day making it work. So, I hope that you will drop by the Discord. I hope that you will come and help us watch the balloon go up and learn how to get your Hawg on. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.